Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my disclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insight. And I hope you all had a wonderful 4th of July. And I also hope that everybody listening to this still has all 10 fingers. On them, I should say. And now that we have covered some important American symbols, I thought it would be a good time to discuss what led to this great country declaring its independence from the deadbeat dad of the world, Great Britain, all those years ago. Of course, I am referring to the events that sparked the Revolutionary War. So please join me as I dive into the history that helped create the United States of America. USA! 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 Sorry, I had to get that out of me. But anyway, yes. Now on to the history. Tensions began mounting even before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. For some 150 years, England treated the North American colonies with what one politician would describe as salutary neglect. During this time, colonists made their own legislatures, passed local laws, levied local taxes, and determined how those taxes should be spent. So naturally, when the British government started passing acts that imposed new taxes on the colonists and restricted settlement on the American frontier, some colonists thought that their personal liberties were being attacked. The tension may have started in 1763, when at least a dozen nations of Native Americans overran many of the British forts along the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. And they also raided colonial settlements and killed or captured 2,000 colonists and drove out 4,000 more. Hoping to curb the violence, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 declared that all territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains off limits to settlement, and settlers hoping to move west were furious. And it should be noted the British did not do this out of concern for Native Americans, but because they did not want Americans spreading out where they would be even more difficult to control, according to one historian named Christopher Brown. So naturally, it all comes down to control. The first direct attempt to tax the 13 colonies was the Stamp Act. And under the Stamp Act, no one could obtain a license or a loan, transfer land, draft a will, earn a diploma, or purchase a newspaper unless the documents were printed or written on English-made paper which bore a stamp embossed by the Royal Treasury, for which the colonists had to pay. And although the taxes levied by the Stamp Act were rather small, many colonists feared the Stamp Act could set a precedent for the British government to impose larger taxes in the future. Colonial newspapers and pamphlet makers were the businesses that were hit the hardest by the Stamp Act and rallied against it and declared the Stamp Act illegitimate, and protesters took to the streets across the colonies in opposition. The Stamp Act would eventually be repealed in 1766. However, this would be followed by the Townsend's Act of 1767, so the British government continued to struggle with war debt. And in the summer of 1767, the British government introduced the Townsend's Act, which imposed new taxes on 5 items: glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. And in response, the Sons of Liberty called for a new boycott of British goods. The boycotts gave American women a significant role in public life. The Daughters of Liberty boycotted tea, fabric, and toys, and produced homespun cloth and other material created in the colonies. And reacting to this, the British sent 2 regiments to police Boston, Massachusetts, which was a key port and one of the centers of colonial resistance. And this led to an event that many people say sparked the Revolution. On March 5th, 1770, British soldiers fired upon a group of colonists, which killed 5 and wounded others. In front of the Customs House on King Street in Boston, British soldiers fired upon a group of colonists, which started because of a disagreement between an apprentice wig maker and a British soldier. When the Americans began taunting the British and throwing things at them, the soldiers lost their cool and began firing into the crowd. And when the smoke cleared, it revealed that 3 men, including an African-American sailor named Crispus Attucks, were dead, and 2 others were mortally wounded. After this came one of the other most famous events that led to the Revolution, and that, of course, is the Boston Tea Party, which started with the Tea Act in 1773, which was started to save the East India Company from bankruptcy. And so Parliament passed a new Tea Act in 1773, which was designed to undercut smuggling and reduce the cost of tea. Parliament thought the act was a win-win-win, as it allowed them to save the East India Company and give Americans cheaper, non-smuggled tea. But colonial merchants who profited from smuggling portrayed the law as yet another assault on American rights. John Adams himself stated, "No American had consented to the tea tax, therefore no American need pay it." Across the colonies, government-appointed tea agents were persuaded, or coerced, it could be said, into refusing any tea. To protest this, at least 4 dozen, or possibly even more, men crudely disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships belonging to the East India Company, opened 342 crates of tea, and dumped more than 46 tons of tea into the harbor. In response to this, the British government decided that it had to tame the colonists, and in spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws called the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor until restitution was paid for the tea. They also replaced the colony's elected council with one appointed by the British government, gave sweeping powers to the British military governor, General Thomas Gage, and forbade town meetings without approval. And another provision protected British officials who were charged with capital offenses from being tried in Massachusetts, and instead required that they be sent to another colony or back to Great Britain for trial. But I think the act that cut the deepest, and the one that probably was the straw that broke the camel's back, was the Quartering Act, which allowed British military officials to demand accommodations for their troops in unoccupied houses and buildings in towns, rather than having to stay out in the countryside. And although it didn't force the colonists to board troops in their own homes, they did have to pay for the expense of housing and feeding the soldiers. The quartering of troops eventually became one of the grievances which was cited in the Declaration of Independence, and also in the Constitution, specifically the Third Amendment, which specifically states, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." But this was definitely the straw that broke the camel's back, because in 1775, the first battle of the Revolutionary War, or I think what could be called the first battle, happened. In April of 1775, British General Thomas Gage led his group of British soldiers from Boston to Lexington, where he planned to capture colonial radical leaders Sam Adams and John Hancock, and then go to Concord and seize their gunpowder. However, American spies heard of the plan, and with the help of writers such as Paul Revere, the word spread to be ready for the British. And on the Lexington Common, the British force was confronted by 77 armed colonists, and they began shooting at each other. Another militiaman managed to stop the British at Concord and continued to harass them on their retreat back to Boston, and at least 49 Americans were killed, 39 were wounded, and 5 went missing. The British lost 73 people, with another 174 wounded and 26 missing in action. The bloody encounter proved to the British that the colonists were definitely a force to be reckoned with and had to be taken seriously. And when the Revolution started, people wanted self-government, and they got that in the form of the Continental Congress, which was the governing body by which American colonial governments coordinated their resistance to the British during the first 2 years of the American Revolution. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774, with delegates from each of the 13 colonies except Georgia. And on October 20th, the Congress adopted the Articles of Association, which stated that if the intolerable acts were not repealed by the 1st of December, 1774, a boycott of British goods would happen in the colonies. The articles also made plans for an embargo on exports if the intolerable acts were not repealed before September 10th, 1775. On October 21st, the delegates approved the separate statements for the people of Great Britain and the North American colonies, explaining the colonial position, and on October 26th, a similar address was approved for the people of Quebec. That's French Canada, for those of you who don't know. On October 26th, the delegates created a formal petition outlining the colonists' grievances for King George III. Although many delegates were skeptical about changing the king's attitude towards the colonies, but they believed that every opportunity should be used to de-escalate the conflict before taking more action. They did not draft such a letter to the British Parliament, as the colonists viewed the Parliament as the aggressor behind the Intolerable Acts. And by the time Congress met again, war was already underway, and so the delegates to the Second Continental Congress formed the Continental Army and dispatched General George Washington to Massachusetts as its commander. And meanwhile, Congress drafted the Olive Branch Petition, which tried to suggest means of resolving disputes between the colonies and Great Britain. And Congress sent the petition to King George III on July 8th, but he refused to see it. And as British authority crumbled in the colonies, the Continental Congress took over as the de facto national government, thereby exceeding the initial authority granted to it by the individual colonial governments. However, local groups that had formed to enforce the colonial boycott continued to support Congress. And the Second Congress continued to meet until March 1st, 1781, when the Articles of Confederation that established a new national government for the United States took effect. And as the de facto national government, the Continental Congress took the role of negotiating diplomatic agreements with foreign nations. The British Parliament banned trade with the colonies and authorized the taking of colonial vessels on December 23rd. Not a very good Christmas present, if you ask me. These actions served to further degrade the positions of anti-independence moderates in Congress and bolster those of pro-independence leaders. And on April 6th, 1776, Congress responded to the Parliament's actions by opening American ports to all foreign ships except British vessels. Reports from the American agent Arthur Lee in London also served to support the revolutionary cause. His report suggested that France was interested in assisting the colonies in their fight against Great Britain, and with a peaceful resolution becoming more and more unlikely, in 1775, Congress began to explore other diplomatic channels and dispatched congressional delegate Silas Deane to France in 1776. And Mr. Deane succeeded in getting informal French support by May, and at that time Congress was conducting international diplomacy and had drafted the model treaty with which it hoped to seek alliances with Spain and France. And on July 4th, 1776, Congress formally declared the colonies' independence from Great Britain. And in September, Congress adopted the model treaty and then sent commissioners to France to negotiate a formal alliance. They entered into a formal alliance with France in 1778, and Congress eventually sent diplomats to other European powers to encourage support for the American cause and to secure loans for the war effort. Congress and the British Parliament made further attempts to reconcile, but the negotiations failed when Congress refused to revoke the Declaration of Independence, both in a meeting on September 11, 1776, with the British Admiral Richard Howe, and when a peace delegation from Parliament arrived in Philadelphia in 1778. And so Congress spelled out terms for peace on August 14, 1779, which demanded British withdrawal, American independence, and navigation rights on the Mississippi River. The next month, Congress appointed John Adams to negotiate such terms with England, but British officials refused, and formal peace negotiations would have to wait until after the Confederation Congress took over the reins of the government on March 1st, 1781, following American victories at Yorktown that resulted in British willingness to end the war. The war would come to an end in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, thanks in a great part to Ben Franklin and the Secret Committee of Correspondence created in 1775. Their duty was to communicate with colonial agents in Britain and I quote, friends in other parts of the world. Had it not been for France, we may have never won the Revolutionary War. Because, hey, the French hated the British almost as much as we did. Well, folks, it looks as if the clock has kind of came up on us again. I'm sorry, but, it looks like I'm going to have to sign off here. And what have we learned today? Well, I think we've learned that we Americans are a resilient bunch who definitely know how to make the best of a bad situation. I mean, after all, just look at what happened during the Revolutionary War, and before, I might add. I think we've also learned you can always get by with a little help from a friend. And so with that, I say goodbye and God bless.